Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today's the 7th of July, and over the past 24 hours, we've witnessed numerous Russian advances across the line of contact, beginning with Sumy, and then we'll look at what's going on in Kupyansk and the broader Oskil riverfront. Then a lot of the video will be devoted to the Kramatorsk direction in the urban battle in Kostyantynivka, followed by Ukrainian advances in Stepnohirsk. To finish off, though, we're going to look at the Ukrainian drone campaign that is inflicting a lot of damage on the Crimean energy grid, along with strikes overnight that targeted 10 tankers that were going through the Sea of Azov. We'll also discuss more generally this issue of Ukraine's lack of PAC-3 interceptors and the way in which that's preventing them from dealing with ballistic missile barrages, and some of the solutions that may be raised by the Europeans now that the NATO summit is underway in Turkey. Let's zoom in, though, and begin by looking at what's going on in Sumy, where the Russian forces have advanced north of Komarivka, capturing 0.57 square miles of territory, and it's an advance northwards of about 1.2 miles using the measuring stick over here. We can see that they're approaching the towns of Lonove and Yasterbushina, and there's a geolocation to back it up. So on July 6th, the 27th Artillery Brigade, they conducted artillery and FPV strikes onto various tree lines, and those are locations where Russian forces and DRGs were accumulating. The compilation also shows how their drone interceptors were able to take down 11 Molniya 2 UAVs. And, there's dozens of those clips of Molniya 2s being intercepted on a regular basis. But the sheer volume of Molniya 2s still means that many of them go through and inflict a lot of damage on Ukrainian static positions in tree lines and dugouts near ground zero of the front line. And I forgot to change the classification of this polygon over here, but if you guys recall, in recent days, the Russian forces have been reactivating their assault efforts in this region, and so they've been advancing past Sopich and moving really either parallel or directly along the E101 highway in the direction of Bachivsk. And this is an area where the Ukrainians have, over the past 2 to 3 months, beefed up their manpower on the ground, because we can name several units that are deployed over here, including elements of the 101st TDF Brigade. I think the 104th may also have a presence over here, but it's also the 15th National Guard Brigade, and then a couple of UAV units, and then actually one of the battalions of the 33rd Assault Regiment was here early on. I don't know if they're still operating around here, but as for the 104th, the 4th Battalion is over here, and they've been engaged in some of the fiercest clashes in the Sopich direction in particular. Moving southeastwards, though, we're looking at what's going on in Kupyansk, or just the north of it. So we had this outstretched Ukrainian salient that was located very close to the Oskil River itself and some of the nearby embankments and tree lines. And at some point, the Russian forces, it's not a relatively new development, it's just something that's now been confirmed based on just a unanimous announcement from a wide variety of sources, that now the Russian forces have been able to enter into some of the ditches and tree lines located directly east of Petroivanivka and Mitrofanivka. As you can see over here, I'm highlighting them with these red lines over here. And this is a part of a process of advancing past the, direct western bank of the river towards the next chain of villages in this region. The Russians already have been able to make some headway in this regard because they entered into Novovasilivka, as we see over here on June 28th. They also entered into Vikholivka. This means that the remaining Ukrainians near the line of contact are sort of wedged in between these two northern and southern flanks, respectively. So the Russian objective over here, both from north and south and from the east with its direct advance, is to squeeze the Ukrainians out of these two villages, and then from there solidify control over the entire chain that is connected by a singular paved road. And that has implications more broadly for this town over here, Kolodiazny. The goal would be to get control over Kolodiazny as well, and to link up with some of the furthest Russian positions, deepest Russian positions past the river that are based out of Varichno, and all of the various extensions or appendages that you see over here running along the highway or running into Kudkivka. So that's a part of Russia's broader objective over here. And we've talked a lot about how they eventually want to shape the operations over here in order to make it to Veliki Burluk. The problem is this is not a Russian priority right now. Even though they are advancing on a local level, there are positional advances like this one over here, the 3.1 square mile advance. The Russian deployments on the ground over here are not significant enough for a major campaign in the direction of Veliki Burluk. And so for now, we're really talking about these sort of pinprick movements every few weeks. Until anything changes with the unit composition, I can't see the pace changing significantly. However, to the south, slightly, where there is far more focus, is Kupyansk itself. And the Russian forces are currently in the midst of a campaign to clear out most of the eastern bank. Some Russian sources already claim that essentially everything located to the east of Kupyansk has fallen into their hands, meaning all of southeastern Kupyansk and then all of Kupyansk Vyslovy. Now, the Ukrainians do still have a presence over there, and so those allegations are premature. And in some cases, the Russians are striking them with artillery, cab strikes, FPV strikes, and so there's still a presence, although it's far weaker than it was before. And sometimes it's transient, meaning they move in and out of the eastern bank. They don't always remain over there, and if they do, they're hidden in basements. But the Russian forces certainly are advancing. For instance, they've been able to take over in recent days the northern chunk of Podoli, which amounts to about 0.83 square miles of territory being seized. The goal over here is to squeeze the Ukrainians out of their forward positions in some houses in southern Petropavlivka, along with a lot of dugouts in this forested patch that you see in the far east of the pockets, which is not even solidly under Ukrainian control. Based on my classification, it's more so a gray zone at this point. But there are still small squads operating over there, and that is restricting Russia's close quarters frontline mobility, so you don't have a streamlined connection between the forces operating St. Kucherivka and the ones that are moving right now from Kurylivka into Kupyansk Vyslovy. That could all change once there is a final closure of this cauldron south of Petropavlivka. And from there, you'd see a more unified Russian effort to take over the rest of Podoli, which is also largely in a gray zone, and also to seep in permanently into Kupyansk Vyslovy, which, again, the Russians do have a presence over here, even if it's not permanent. They have DRGs that often enter into the town. It's not too difficult because, again, their forward positions aren't that far away. It's only about 1.2 miles southwest of the current line of contact. And so there are many speculative entrances, reconnaissance operations, or sabotage events that occur inside, but it's not ever been able to metastasize into anything larger, although right now it's headed in that direction. And there's a lot of opportunities for small squads to do this sort of maneuver because they have to just pass through Podoli, where they have fixed positions in basements, move through the forested areas where they have a lot of concealment and it won't be spotted by aerial reconnaissance, and then they arrive again at fixed positions in large factories or near the rail station, where again they can seek cover and are able to avoid being spotted by the Ukrainians. So all in all, the situation over here continues to trend in Russia's direction. Another area where they've been able to clear out a lot of areas that were previously under Ukrainian control or otherwise a gray zone, directly south of Pischane. So over here we have this polygon mined as 3.67 square miles of territory. At most, the Russians are able to advance south of the rail line towards this ravine and adjacent pond, and it amounts to a 2-mile push southwards. Right now, this is the other section of the eastern bank of the Oskil River, and it's far larger in terms of surface area compared to the aforementioned one that is largely a gray zone. And the Ukrainian presence over here in terms of just raw manpower is also larger. It also extends further to the east when we measure it. We can measure from the western bank, or rather eastern bank of the Oskil River, all the way to the eastern edge of the gray zone, and it's about 7 miles. And so it is a formidable chunk of territory that is currently being pressured along multiple vectors by the Russians, but particularly from the north. The Russians already are infiltrating into the center of Kupyansk Vyslovy with not only DRGs, but also larger assault squads that are trying to clear out individual houses. There's also the efforts by DRGs to take advantage of the various forested patches that surround Kiev-Sharivka, and they're using those as entry points into the apartment complexes like Mikrorayon 2, or quite literally the center of the town. And we've seen examples of them, for instance, advancing from Kurylivka, from the warehouses south of it, and then from there using the tree lines as a route, and from there entering into eastern Kiev-Sharivka. And because they're able to hop from house to house, and whenever there may be some sort of danger spotted, they're able to remain hidden within cellars. And because the Ukrainian presence over here is so thin, they don't have the ability to counterattack and actually go in and comb and push the Russians out. It's more so that they have some soldiers manning the perimeter of some of these towns and holding on to strong points for defensive purposes to deter the Russians, but they can't actually go out and conduct an active defense. And so, for the most part, the sort of casualty inflicting operations are done by the heavy drone bombers, for instance, using Baba Yaga drones, dropping grenades or mines from them. So what I was trying to get at over here is that sometimes they're able to infiltrate so deep, these Russian squads, that they're able to reach Novosinove from the north, Although for now, nothing's really been solidified. But that's the direction in which it's trending. And the goal is to basically squeeze the Russians out, or rather the Ukrainians, out of everything that's located to the east of Hlushivka, for instance. And then from there would be some sort of stabilization near the forests on either end of the Oskil River. That's the trend that we're seeing in this direction as well. Moving southwards, the Ukrainians have been able to make some gains in Novi and in Counterattacks. Their counterattacks over here amount to 1.3 square miles of territory. We've seen a lot of this being admitted by Russian sources like Radov on their depiction of the situation over here. Again, the Ukrainians don't have full control over Nova, but they have a presence that's relatively voluminous in the northern section, as well as the western parts of Counterattacks. And so we're seeing a bit of stabilization with the front line over here, with the Russians retaining control over Zelena Dolina, and then a lot of their heights and ravines and various plots of land further eastwards. And so they aren't in any majorly exposed positions right now, as opposed to the exception of everything that's located between Seredny and Alexandrivka, because this area is definitely in an outstretched position and is held by, a very thin group of infantry. It's not large by any means. But the maximalist Ukrainian objective, as we talked about going back to last month, was to actually get control over Shandrikholove, Novoselivka, Darilove, and by extension, also Eastern Drobisheve, and ultimately to relieve the pressure that Liman was experiencing on the northwestern flank. Now, the Ukrainians haven't paused, and they do still have some operational tempo over here, and so the assaults can continue. But for now, the Russians from the 25th Combined Arms Army, I think that's the element that is, largely responsible for this region. They've sort of reorganized in a way to try to remain compact and hold on to these key towns, because loss of them would be able to serve as a lifeline for Liman on one hand, but it would also deny the Russians an option later down the line throughout the rest of 2026 to reassert control over areas like Yarovo and Sviatohirsk and Sosnove, where their DRGs were able to infiltrate at the beginning of 2026 due to extremely thin Ukrainian manning of the front line. And then eventually, it was pretty clear their goal was to cross over and use this entire forested patch north of Slovyansk as a sort of playground by which to infiltrate the northern outskirts of the city in conjunction with an attack coming in from the east. Obviously, none of that can happen if the Russians can't even have access to the Donetsk River and its northern bank, which is why the Ukrainian attacks over here were so significant in the first place. But looking further southwards, we are seeing Russian progress directly east of Slovyansk, so that has to be noted. A lot of the outstretched Ukrainian salients and pockets that have been used to drag out the fighting and hold on to areas that are just so far away, comically far away from the rear. A lot of those areas now have reached a breaking point due to wear and tear. As we all know, Siersky, he signed in April this order due to an issue with the Eastern Bank in Kupyansk with the 14th Mechanized Brigade, saying that any soldier cannot be forced to hold a position for more than 60 days. After 60 days, they have 30 days to plan a withdrawal operation for the individual, and they have to be replaced with some other infantryman. And on paper, I've already talked about this, but just to reiterate, it sounds good on paper because, it's reducing the amount of time that a soldier has to remain within the danger zone. But in reality, it's difficult because sometimes these soldiers, they stay within a certain dugout or position for the entirety of those 2 months without even leaving, because the second they do, they're going to be exposed to drone crews in hostile territory, and then they have to fight their way out, or they have to spend that entire time trying to evade getting struck by FPVs. And so forcing, based on an arbitrary date, a withdrawal, even if the circumstances aren't really ready for that, due to higher up orders, that leads to increased casualties in many cases. And sometimes it forces the local commanders, the battalion commanders in this case, to rotate in soldiers that otherwise perhaps may not have been sent because they weren't prepared, or it wasn't even their role in the first place. Perhaps they were serving in logistics or engineering, but now they're being given this task because, due to regulations from the commander-in-chief, there is no other choice. And so that also opens up a whole other can of worms about the effectiveness of the policy, because the core of the idea is to try to reduce the strain on soldiers and to prevent them from being in these catastrophic situations where they aren't connected by any sort of ground means to logistics. And so they have to rely entirely on drones and sometimes on unmanned ground vehicles. But even those are difficult when we talk about the sort of distances that we see over here. Because look at it. Orkhovatka, which is the nearest village that isn't like at ground zero over the front line, it was about 8.8 miles away from the furthest East Ukrainian position. And so there's no way to actually resupply that. It's a suicide mission to go in and out. But nonetheless, you had Ukrainian soldiers, a handful of them, that remained over here for months, located in these forested areas. And of course, they couldn't be spotted and they weren't ultimately killed while they were here because they just remained hidden underground. There's various shafts and camouflage over here. And so they could stay put. And for the Russians, they just, turned another eye, they turned a blind eye to it while they advanced elsewhere. But eventually, it does begin to interfere with Russian mobility and connection between different, organs of their offensive attacks. For instance, the connection between Alexandrivka and Yurivka, it's certainly compromised when they don't have full control over everything in between. And so now they're making an effort to just seal it off. So starting off, they've been able to, over the past few days, take control over 4.4 square miles of territory in the furthest east section of the pocket where you have all these forested strips. And now the next objective will be to take over populated areas in northern Nikiforivka and Lepivka along the Vasyukivka River, where again the Ukrainians remain situated and also are located in a couple of higher elevated strongholds, for instance, in this forested patch as well, in directly south of Alexandrivka. But ultimately, the goal is to stabilize the front line so it runs along the Donbas Canal. That way, the Russians have control over the eastern bank, which is on a high elevation, and can use it as a platform to reach Orychovatka from the south and from the east. Again, these are very important towns because they're used as a linchpin and as the first staging point past the canal. And then from there, we can turn on the fortification maps for this. Looking at it over here, it's not that far away from Slovyansk itself. It's not about having, all of the conditions set in stone for a head-on assault onto Slovyansk, but it's just about having enough distance, closing the gap such that DRGs can begin to harass the eastern outskirts of the city so the Ukrainians can't take advantage of time and, have enough of that to prepare for a perimeter defense. So Orychovatka is less than 5 miles away from the Cherevkovka microdistrict in eastern Slovyansk, and so that area will begin to feel some of the pressure on the ground once the Russians are able to actually take over this village across the Donbas Canal, which is why it's so important for the Russians to just get control over any sort of Ukrainian vestiges that are trying to delay the course of that fighting. Similar thing is going on over here to the south because the Russians recently took over about 1.5 square miles of territory south of Minkivka as they're trying to, again, get the line to falter along the canal. And for the time being, the Ukrainians do still retain positions west of Holubivka. They're still resisting over here, and that's in an effort to deny the Russians, full-fledged access to the ridge on the canal and the static positions on either end where you have tree lines that are very well established. And then from there, it would be easier for them to get full control over these towns such as Tikhonivka and Malanivka. From there, they would have the forward bases necessary in order to begin a village hopping campaign and advancing along certain routes that are pretty evident just by looking at the satellite imagery, for instance, running along paved roads and low-lying depressions and ravines and gullies to make it to Persha Marivka. And this town over here, I think it's called Vasyukivska or something like that. And then past that point, again, I have to reiterate that the fortification map over here is outdated. It's way more voluminous than what you see over here. There's a lot more lines and barbed wire that isn't even shown, but not all of it is being manned, of course. You can't man every single kilometer of the front line with dozens of soldiers. It's simply not feasible over here, especially out in the open like this in an area where you don't have many basements and it's all reliant on obstacles like anti-tank ditches and trenches. Those areas cannot be manned by 50 people per kilometer because that's just going to lead to a high density of Russian firepower being directed in the direction, and it will lead to high casualties. And so for the most part, the soldiers are being stationed within the apartment complexes in the center of Kramatorsk. And then if there's some sort of combat mission needed, or if they need to hold on to a certain area, a small group is dispatched for a certain period of time towards some of the towns over here, or towards some of the larger fortifications. But it's not a large grouping that is sent out all at once. That's simply against the mechanics of the nature of the war at this point. And that leaves Kramatorsk exposed from the east, even if on paper it looks like it's highly fortified. And so all of that means, just going back to the original point, that the Ukrainians must, for as much time as they can, just try to delay the fighting by remaining in these geometrically ambiguous positions. They just look like they're begging to get cut off, but because of the nature of the fighting, cutting off doesn't really mean anything anymore, because obviously the soldiers over here located near this tree line, they are pretty much cut off. They're not receiving any sort of supplies from the rear at this point. It's all through drones, but they are still holding on because it's a means by which they can distract the Russians and deny them, a lot of maneuverability. But all in all, the Russians are not making an effort to seal it off. Moving southwards, though, let's look at Kostyantynivka. Over here, the Russian forces have been able to enter the Novoselivka microdistrict, although the progress isn't necessarily that significant. It's just another 184 acres of territory, and it's a push northwestwards of, let's see, 0.5 miles. The Ukrainians are still trying to their best hold on to Novoselivka and even parts of the northern Chervony, all with the intention of delaying the inevitable Russian assault that would arrive at Alexeyevo-Drofskivka. Also, Ukrainian drone crews have become more active in recent days in this area and are trying to individually pick off Russian soldiers as they make their way from the center of Kostyantynivka, or rather the southwest, where you have the major apartment complexes, and then from there towards the Nakhalivka district. I think that's what it's called over here, which is running along Prospect Lomonosova, and that's where a lot of Ukrainian drone drops have been occurring recently. I should also say that I've changed the marking of the front line to show that the Ukrainians are in control of Novobalka and Roskishnya. And this is based on the geolocation from July 3rd that I just missed, but I have to correct the record. The 238th Artillery Brigade, they conducted shelling and dropped grenades onto Ukrainian soldiers over here. It seems like the assault that the Russians were able to achieve over here in mid-June, it definitely happened. There was definitely a Russian presence over here, but it was likely a bridge too far and not really connected to the main Russian objective, which was to just go head on and assault Kostyantynivka. And you don't really need Novobalka or Roskishnya for the purposes of advancing through the city itself. Berestokh is far more important in that regard, and so is Zelenivka. And that's why the Ukrainians are striking them so hard with their air force right now. But Novobalka and Roskishnya, they're more peripheral. And you don't even need them for Ostikova at this point, because the Russians can just directly advance through Novoselivka. And so the Ukrainians took advantage of that, and they were able to pounce on an exposed location and were able to stabilize the front line as a result. Now, I'm going to continue working my way southwestwards until I see that I marked somewhere on the map in advance. I think that the only other change that occurred over the past 24 hours is in Stepnohirsk, where the Ukrainians were able to take back much of the town, much of what the Russians still held on to, with I think the 108th VDV regiment or brigade, I don't remember. Over here, they captured 166 acres of territory, and at most, the Ukrainians were able to advance southwards by 0.5 miles, so it is important to mention. Now, we have the geolocations to back it up, because on July 7th, the Russians released footage of them shelling and conducting FPV strikes against houses and apartments in Stepnohirsk. So now the Ukrainians are in the process of clearing out the remaining streets that are located north of this floodplain. So that would include Tavrivska streets. And then past that point, the only part of Stepnohirsk that will remain is microdistrict number 3, where you have these major apartment complexes that serve as a great firing spot and vantage point to overlook the floodplains and the lower elevated spots of Stepnohirsk and Plavny. So that's an area that the Russians must retain control over. If losing Stepnohirsk itself wasn't bad enough, then losing that would be even worse. It would also give the Ukrainians access to the paved road that connects to Kupyansk, and then the Russians would be back at square one after like a year of fighting in this direction. And so one of the ways to prevent this would be to retake Plavny, because, again, this compromises the western flank of the E105 highway and of the microdistrict. And, this will ultimately be the responsibility of the 247th Regiment and the 108th Regiment and various other VDV elements that are deployed over here. Now, to look at the entire campaign, because I was mentioning this at the beginning of the video, the campaign against Crimea, the Ukrainians have really ramped it up since the beginning of July. Since July 1st, it's confirmed that the Ukrainians have stuck 58 targets, and that includes 29 that are part of the broader energy infrastructure in the peninsula. So largely substations, including some high voltage ones like the 330 kilovolt one near, I think it was Sevastopol, but also in Simferopol. And that led to a lot of blackouts, and it eventually reached a boiling point on July 6th, which is when we saw massive blackouts throughout pretty much the entirety of the peninsula. By the end of the day, we saw that there were emergency rerouting operations. And so, again, we talked about the stability of Ukraine's electricity grid in the last video and how they've been resilient and able to rely upon backups. The Russians have the same sort of system, and they can have the same sort of emergency measures that very quickly are able to alleviate the harm felt by the population whenever there's a blackout. And so very quickly, most of the substations have been restored. Even if there's still underlying damage, there are backup power lines, even sometimes backup transformers, although that takes way longer to install or replace unless you're using some sort of mobile transformer or a generator. But as a result, by today, July 7th, for the most part, we've seen electricity restored in Simferopol, Sevastopol, southern Crimea, and eastern Crimea, which are the most important parts of the peninsula. The more rural parts of northern Crimea, they're still suffering from a lot of issues, though. And so that's an area that's being ignored. Even in July 5th, which is before the major blackouts, when we saw the before and after of 2025 versus 2026, and we saw the overnight light imagery from geostationary satellites, even then we saw that there was at least some volume of light being, shown in luminosity coming from southern Crimea, where you have higher population density. But literally nothing was left from the northern parts in the rural areas, especially in the west of the peninsula, even though there are some towns over there. So you'd expect to see something, but due to the damage to the, lower intensity, 110 kilovolt, for instance, substations over there, it wasn't able to be, detected from the outer space orbits. So over the past week, the Ukrainians have also hit 16 electricity assets or energy assets within the Russian-controlled parts of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So that's also a part of their broader campaign, but it's using shorter-range assets. At the same time, they struck 6 targets in airfields, in particular in Havardivske, in Saki, and Jankoy. Jankoy being one of the most notable, but you see Havardivske over here, Jankoy located a bit to the north. There were also strikes on 11 other military targets, including air defense sites, radar systems, electronic warfare posts, and then also on the ports, like the Kerch port and the oil and gas terminal over there. And most notably, overnight, 10 tankers were hit, and they carried a total of 70,000 tons of gasoline. And that's the same or the equivalent of transporting that amount of gasoline on 2,000 railway tank cars. So that is just a really important amount. Just to quantify it within the context of the energy crisis in Crimea, Crimea has a daily fuel demand of between 3,000 to 4,000 tons. So this kind of shipment, it could have been enough for 3 weeks of resupply. And just recall that over this time period, gasoline sales for civilians have been suspended since June 21st. So it's been very difficult for civilians to acquire what they need for the refueling of their vehicles. And they can't do it by cash or by the vouchers, which is what the Russians initially used in order to try to reduce the per pound consumption by each individual civilian. So for the most part, the reserves that are coming across through ferries or through the Crimean Bridge, which again, the Russians aren't using the Kerch Bridge that much for the transport of oil because they're scared that the Ukrainians will end up striking it. So the main route being used is, of course, the Novorossiya route coming from Rostov-on-Don all the way into northern Crimea. In any case, though, it's mainly going for the government, for emergency services, and for the military, which again is understandable in the context of the war efforts. But the video that was released by the 414th Birds of Magyar UAV Brigade was truly insane. They specifically, the 414th Brigade, claims to have hit 8 tankers, although in total it was 10 because you also had the involvement of the 427th Rarog Brigade, which is also a very active mid-range strike unit at this point. Even though they started off as just conducting a lot of frontline strikes, now they have various detachments that are involved with different ranges. So they struck in total 10 tankers. They also struck a cargo ship and a ferry that were on their way to Crimea. The tankers, as we were saying before, had 7,000-ton cargo carrying capacity. And that's a bit smaller compared to some of the major tankers that you see in Russia's quote-unquote shadow fleet, as the Ukrainians refer to it. So these ones specifically, they were used for the transport of gasoline and diesel, but not, crude, which would be much larger. The tankers also had a length of 140 meters, and they were between 15 to 20 years old. All of them were somehow sanctioned by the US or the EU. And the problem is that they were all, moving in this one large group, so it was easy to spot them, and there was no speed, so they couldn't maneuver once the assault started. And they had no mobile air defense crews from what we were seeing in the footage. So that's going to have to be the solution from now on, to have the Russians deploying their own air defense assets onto the ships or right next to them as they're transporting them. And that also opens up the air defense crews to being exposed and to suffering damage. But that's the only solution to having the continued transit of large quantities of gasoline and diesel towards this exposed Crimean Peninsula. And it's absolutely necessary that it continues. But it has to be done through some sort of protection now. That's the next step. And this really goes back to the conversation that we were having about the Omsk oil refinery. The strikes on the ships in the Sea of Azov, they were inflicted due to new modifications to the FP2, and the Omsk refinery was struck by FP1 drones that received extended range. So we'll get into their changes in a second, but just an update on the Omsk oil refinery itself. They temporarily halted operations, and that was notified to everybody else in the market in the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange. So the crude distillation unit CDU-10, that's an area where there was a direct impact from what we saw, and operations were halted there as well. It's responsible for 38% of the plant's production capacity, and it has a daily capacity of 24,580 metric tons, so just absolutely insane. And then you have CDU-11, which is another processing unit. It was also halted. It's responsible for 37% of the capacity of the refinery and produces 24,000 tons of oil daily, or rather processes it. That means that those two together account for 3/4 of the entire facility. You have CDU 8 and 7, which sort of act as backups. And so I think those will be up and running faster in order to just address the backlog as time goes on. But here we can see that over here, there were at least 4 impacts shown in satellite imagery. So the damage itself probably isn't that massive from what we see over here, but it's enough to cause temporary shutdowns, which will have reverberations for the region and then also for the entire market over here. And we can also recall that the Ilu AVT-11, which is an area that was struck, it has a capacity of 8.4 million tons of oil per year. I know that initially some of the Ukrainian sources allege that there were 8 FP1s involved in the attack and that only one of them was intercepted by a Su-57 and that the other 7 impacted. But over here, it just shows that 4 of them were able to hit. So I don't know what happened to the other 3 based on their chain of events. A big problem with areas that are further and further away from the front line, and because of Russia's geographic nature and the reality of it being the largest country in the world, it's impossible for ground air defense assets to be deployed in every single strategic location, in every single city, in every single factory. It's simply unfeasible, especially considering the fact that a disproportionate amount of air defense assets are being deployed to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and then you also need to have them along the border with Ukraine and in Crimea. So when all that is considered, it becomes more difficult to have a significant amount of Pantsirs or S-300s or S-400s or Buk M2s or Buk M3s deployed to areas like Omsk that are, like 2,500 kilometers away from the front line. So over here in this case, the Russians, they try to alleviate that situation by having mobile defense crews, but they were all using small arms and also using anti-drone netting. But simply due to the payload of the FP1, having those static protections aren't going to be enough. It's going to be able to absorb the collision with the anti-drone netting, and due to kinetic energy on its own, or whether it has a proximity fuse, it doesn't even matter. Either way, it's able to penetrate through it and cause damage to the facility itself. So there has to be more done than just that. And what happened over here with the FP1 is that it was probably launched from northeastern Ukraine and then followed a path along the Volga River, because those are areas where there may be less coverage, especially if it skims along the lower altitude parts of the river. And from there as well, trying to keep contact with the border with Kazakhstan for as long as possible. And this is something that's been mentioned by Russian sources. They were the ones that were giving out these UAV drone alerts before it hit in Omsk. They said that there were sightings of the FP1s in various oblasts, like in Saratov, Orenburg, Chelyabinsk, up until it arrived in Omsk. And so that just gives you guys an idea of the broad flight path coming from there and not from any place else like Kazakhstan. And as we all know already, an A-50 was deployed for radar support, and I'm going to be very interested to see if that continues, because you need 4 A-50s or 4 AWACS of any kind to be in a country's arsenal for one of them to be deployed in the air for 24 hours. And for 2 of them to be deployed up in the air 24/7, you need to have 7 in total. That's just the mathematics of it in order to have some sort of reserve. And so in this case, the Russians really are starting to use it for the first time after we haven't seen it kind of in this sort of active phase. It was kind of dormant for the past year or so. And it provided support for the Su-57 as it was involved in shooting down some of those drones. But all in all, what I was trying to say over here is that the FP1 has undergone major modifications, and new designs meant that it has less drag and that its new wings that are larger are able to distribute the lift more evenly across the surface. So that has a positive effect on the fuel consumption on its range. So the range went from 1,600 to 2,600, now to 3,400 kilometers, which is why it was able to travel between 2,800 to 3,000 kilometers on its sort of convoluted route over here until it arrived at Omsk. And that's not going to be the end of it. I'm sure that eventually we'll see things in Novosibirsk and Tomsk as well from the FP1s as their range continues to expand. Also, now we know that there is an additional fuel storage component within the FP1 and that the payload has increased. The FP2s, they also were upgraded, so now it could carry up to 200 kilograms in its warhead, which is a really large amount for a drone, and it has a span of 370 kilometers. So that is a really large range, meaning it could reach pretty much all of Crimea and all of the Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine. So it kind of turns into a mini glide bomb for the Ukrainians. And of course, the Ukrainians actually have their own analog to the Russian Cap bomb. They have the Equalizer, as it's called. It has a 250 kilogram warhead, and it's usually fired from F-16s or Mirage fighter jets. And it can be fired from dozens of kilometers away from the target and acts as a standoff munition. A lot of them are actually being used right now in Kostyantynivka, but that's not the only system they use. They don't use the Equalizer that much. They much prefer the hammers from the French, and they also do use some of the JDAM extended range missiles. So those have special tail wings and GPS guidance. They have, of course, can be attached to 50 or 500 pound MK82 bombs or to 2,000 pound MK84 bombs. And they have a standoff range of 74 kilometers. The problem is they can be very easily jammed by the Russians. We've seen a lot of that over the past couple of years. That's why they prefer, as I was saying before, the AASM hammers from the French. They have anti-electronic warfare countermeasures. In February, France and Norway signed a deal for 1,000 additional hammers that would be sent to Ukraine, and they could be fired from F-16s, Rafales, Mirage 2000Ds, and even adapted for MiG-29s and Su-24s. So the hammer, it converts standard bombs into guided weapons, and they have a built-in rocket booster for the engine. So they can travel at a low altitude and avoid Russian radars and be launched from pretty far away. And due to additional modifications, now some of the hammers actually have a turbojet instead of a regular fuel booster. So the range from which they can be fired changed from being 70 kilometers diagonal to between 150 to 200 kilometers. So the Ukrainians are also using that. As for the JDAMs, there was a deal in May that I read about that the United States would sell another 1,500 kits to the Ukrainians. So they're still getting those as well. And sometimes I see in their strikes on Kostyantynivka that they use the GBU-39 small diameter bombs. Those have a weight of 250 pounds, and they have fold-out wings and a distance or glide distance of 96 kilometers. And just to finish off with one more headline, the United States is currently discussing joint production of AIM-120 AMRAAM radar-guided air-to-air and surface-to-air missiles. And those are either fired from fighter jets like F-16s or F-35s, or from the NASAMS air defense system, which is, again, jointly produced by the U.S. and Norway. Those could be, for the first time, set up in Europe, joint production between American and European companies. Same thing, and more importantly, it's being discussed for Patriot PAC-3s. And primarily, it will be built between the U.S. and Germany, but more broadly, the EU will be involved. Even Lockheed Martin and Rheinmetall, they agreed to establish a co-production of ATACMS in Europe for the first time. And so all of this is still just talking stage. It's not actually something that's being implemented. As we all know, with the Western military-industrial complex, it takes so long for it to get into the momentum and the groove. And the amount of time wasted, I would say, between 2022 up until now, where we haven't seen this implemented, is absolutely insane to think about. And now that it's only now sort of beginning to get implemented and it's still in the early stages, it says a lot about the inertia of, politicians in the U.S. and in the West when it comes to these sort of, ambitious initiatives when it comes to production. But again, PAC-3s are absolutely necessary for Ukraine. Right now, they basically have none. and they don't have any suitable copious alternative to deal with ballistic missiles. So now pretty much the uh, impact rate for Russian ballistic missiles, Iskander-Ms, is going to be 100% until they can receive some sort of stopgap from the EU, and they can receive, PAC-3's emergency reserves from the Europeans. They received in March PAC-3s from Poland, and this was done secretly. And that was during the Iran war, where obviously the US would not give PAC-3s that are needed for Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, Bahrain, to the Ukrainians because they were lower on the priority list. And so Poland, they took responsibility and they sent it over, eating into their own reserves that are needed. Because again, the Russians have their own Iskander silo located in Kaliningrad. So obviously the Poles want to have PAC-3s for themselves. But again, it's not as if the PAC-3 is foolproof and there aren't impacts. We saw very clearly during the Iran war that even the Iranian MRBMs and SRBMs have the ability to impact and cause a lot of damage. And obviously, up until now, when the Ukrainians still had interceptors, there was still a pretty significant hit rates. Right now, the only thing that the Ukrainians have besides the Patriots are the SAMP-T units, and those are European ones. They're produced in France and Italy. So they have 2 of those, but France and Italy said that they're going to send another 8 of them, but who knows when those will come. It's taking forever. And so that's pretty much the situation with that. Obviously, there is now an understanding that there has to be greater production of PAC-3s after the war in Iran, where the U.S. burned through half of its inventory. And that's why they're agreeing to have this joint production occur in Germany. That's likely what's going to happen as the summit in Ankara continues, and there's all the discussions about how to move forward as an alliance between the EU and the US. So a lot of things to keep track of over there. I would also say that I'm keenly looking at the situation with the F-35 program and whether Turkey will be let in, and we'll have to see what that really means. Which sort of F-35 will they receive? How will the process really occur? How will it unfold? Will Congress approve of the sales of F-35s, and will the Pentagon approve it? Will the companies involved be able to write off on it? It's going to take a very long time, even if the Turks are able to get reintroduced. And then I also wonder what's going to happen with S-400s. Will they just, disregard them or say that they're inoperable and just move on? That has a lot of implications for the Turkish-Russian alliance and also for relations between Turkey and Israel. So that's a conversation for another time, but definitely food for thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in